The photograph looks ordinary until you stay with it long enough for the room around you to quiet. A woman in a worn dress holds a boy against her, the way mothers do when something has tried to take their children and failed. The date, penciled lightly on the back, 1931, explains the set of the shoulders, the plainness of the fabric, the way the light is all honesty and no indulgence. Bread lines cut across cities that year like seams. Landlords knocked. Windows rattled with trains bearing men away. In the picture, the woman's hair is pinned up with a caution learned from years of doing without. She has the kind of beauty you only see when the subject isn't worrying about it. Cheekbones made by work, a mouth shaped by resignation and readiness both. Her arms make a shelter around the boy. His body leans into her with the limp trust of a child who knows which way safety is. He wears a coat a little too big, the sleeves rolled, the buttons not quite aligned because someone replaced a missing one with whatever the sewing tin offered. His collar stands not from starch, but from having been ironed and coaxed. One of his socks sags. His hair has been combed faithfully, as if the person who did it believed that combs can set futures as well as parts. And yet, if you let your glance rest where the camera insists it should, on faces, you feel a wrongness that does not announce itself with drama, only with a tug. The boy's face is off by a hair. Not grotesque, not wrong like a mask, just wrong like a hymn sung in a key a half-step flat. The eyes are very clear, too clear. The whites of them gleam in a way the rest of the picture refuses to. The pupils sit straight and glazed, as if someone has polished them. The light on the left side of his cheek arrives from nowhere, the room acknowledges. The mother's face receives a softer fall, a modest shadow under her nose that the boy's nose mysteriously lacks. The grain of his skin is smoother than his hands. The curve of his right ear softens, loses courage, melts into the background. Your thumb, if you run it across the gloss, finds no seam. The paper tells you the scene is real. Your eyes tell you it is not entirely. And because it is 1931, and because hunger rubs people down to bone and truth, and because grief learned long before cameras how to use them, there is a story under the shine. The day before the picture, winter had stubbed its toe on the city and fallen all at once. Smoke stung low in the alleys, pulled in by drafts that refused to keep to one direction. The house on Orchard Street, one window box, one stoop, one kitchen proud of its pot even when the pot was empty, woke to the kind of cold that sits in corners and waits to be noticed. In the bed by the wall, a boy coughed. The cough belonged to February, but the calendar on the nail insisted it was October. The boy's name was Eli, but most days his mother called him Button because she had sewn his first coat from a man's old jacket, and the buttonholes had cheered her with their readiness for another life. He had been a bright, feverish baby who laughed at the corner of a curtain. He had been a toddler prone to pressing his forehead to the floorboards to hear the downstairs neighbor's radio through wood. By 7 he already had a boy's hands, knuckles skinned by curiosity, and a hunger for words like other boys had for sweets. He learned letters off labels and then on a slate and then in a book the librarian let him borrow without saying, which is what she called the gentle crime of easing a child into the habit of print, even when fines were a kind of tax the poor always ended up paying. His mother, her name was Mabel, and it fit her the way old names fit sturdy furniture, had learned to make soup from almost nothing. Water, an onion, a bay leaf so thin it could be mistaken for a promise. When the winter of 1930 had dragged its iron chain across the new year and away, she'd thought, good. Enough. There will be a little less testing. But 1931 decided to be just as proud. Her husband, Joseph, woke one morning and said he heard work in Indiana, a word that sounded like a town's laugh when you don't want to repeat it. He'd kissed the top of Eli's head and said, "Mind your mother." which didn't sound like farewell but turned out to be. Work wasn't in Indiana, or if it wasn't for Joseph. He wrote 2 letters, the kind with sentences that looked like the legs of someone in a hurry, and then the letters stopped. You can keep a stove going on letters if you've nothing else to feed it. Mabel kept the room warm with her hands instead, kneading, scrubbing, mending, holding. Eli's cough came the way winter sometimes comes in the fall, when the city thinks it has time to prepare and then discovers time is a liar. It was small at first. Boys cough, boys run, boys keep a coat open even when told not to because running makes them invincible. Then the cough grew, then the wheeze, then the fever that sat in his eyes like someone had struck a match behind them and refused to blow it out. The doctor at the clinic smelled of camphor and patience. He pressed a stethoscope no richer than a spoon to Eli's back and listened for the C he always wanted to hear quiet and never did. Pneumonia, he said, one hand in the mother's sleeve for a second, a consolation invented because all the other consolations had been used up by women he would never see again. He gave her a bottle lined with paper that made a sound like a moth when opened. He told her to keep the boy warm. The word warm is cruel when it is an instruction and not a fact. She laid him near the stove, set the pot to steam, spooned broth into his mouth sparingly, as if not to embarrass him. He drank little. The cough turned into a conversation he kept having with some invisible visitor who didn't know how to leave. At night she rocked him as if he were small again, and he let her. In the hour before dawn, when city sounds change from night to morning like a shirt turned inside out, she felt him go softer in her arms. He didn't die, not that night, but he turned a corner she didn't know the street name for. He stilled. He was not better, he was not worse. He was paused, as if the person in charge of reels had called to the projectionist to take a rest, and the picture on the screen waited like a held breath. Mabel stayed awake 2 days. She moved his hair from his forehead with a fingertip. She wet a cloth, and then wet his lips with it. She spoke to him the way women do in rooms men do not enter, a steady stream of truth no one else will hear. "Button," she said, "this world is stubborn. You be more stubborn." On the 3rd day the fever broke the way luck sometimes does, less triumph than truce. He slept the long sleep a body sleeps when it has brushed the edge and decided, so far, against falling. And at the edge of that sleep, with daylight patching the floorboards and the clock acting braver than it felt, a thought came to her with ridiculous clarity. She did not have a photograph. Not one. In a city awash in images, in a decade where men with cameras swarmed parades and bread lines and marching bands, in a year when newsboys shouted and the world paid a penny to look at strangers' sorrows, she had no square of paper with her son on it in a way she could keep. Mabel had put off the expense not out of neglect, but out of arithmetic. Photographs cost coal. Photographs cost 3 sacks of flour if you counted hard. Photographs cost a pair of shoes if you added a tip for the kind of professional who looks at you with kindness and asks you to be still. Later, she had said to herself, the way the poor say, someday, as if the vowels will keep them warmer, when Joseph comes home, when there's work again, when the winter ends. She stood very carefully, placed Eli's arm back upon his chest, tucked the blanket around him as if tucking it might tuck misfortune back under the bed. She folded her hands because sudden movements felt like asking for something she didn't deserve. The idea became conviction, a photograph. If he went, she could not finish the sentence, could not form the word that would have made it a complete thought. She would be left with something that held his face in the one way that outlasted breath. The photographer on Hester Street worked in a room that was a contradiction. It was both temple and factory. Costumes hung on a rack for the kind of people who wished to pretend. Babies were set into baskets for the kind of mothers who wanted their infants to appear cradled by vines instead of poverty. Men had their hats placed precisely the way men place hats, when they want them to mean hat and not hunger. The proprietor called himself a portraitist on days when customers who liked big words walked in, and a picture man when customers who preferred small prices did. His name was Mr. Katz, and he had worked with glass and plates until the glass and the plates had worked their way into him. He had a handshake like a book, soft cover but full of density, and a mustache that had decided before the rest of his face what sort of man to be. People came to him to be held still by a chemical that didn't ask questions. People came to him to be told how to stand. People came to him because when Mr. Katz handed you a paper with your face on it, you felt for a second like a person who might end up in a frame and not a ledger. Mabel entered like a breath she had been holding and forced herself to let go bad air before saving room for the good. The bell above the door made a sound that believed in itself. Katz looked up and nodded the way men nod when they recognize a reason even before they know its name. "I need a picture," Mabel said, before courage could discover it had wandered off. "Of me and my son." "How old?" Katz asked, already assembling possibilities. The stool, the standing, the chair for the mother standing with the boy in lap, the boy standing on a narrow box to be as tall as he wanted. He had done children. He had done children with the eyes painted open after, for people who could stand to look at their dead only if the dead pretended not to know. 7, Mabel said. But this week. She clicked her thumbnail against her thumbnail, tiny sound, loud enough for both of them to hear it. He is sleeping. He cannot stand. Katz did a thing she had not expected a stranger to do. He touched his hand flat to his chest, over his own heart, because sometimes the only sentence that makes sense is a gesture. "Bring him," he said softly. "I will come to you if you prefer. We can make a picture." Her eyes wet with humiliation and relief both. "I cannot pay for the carrying," she said, meaning the cost it takes to ask a man to leave his room. "We can come." She had a neighbor with a cart. She had arms that had carried him home and would carry him again. Katz considered the other thing. That thing he had done twice before, and swore after the second he would do only when asked, and only when the asking left no air for argument. "You have any photograph of him? A school? A church?" He did not name the thing. He did not name the trick. She shook her head. "There is one," she said, surprising herself because the word felt like she had discovered a coin in a pocket of a dress she had not worn since spring. "Miss Foster from the school. She takes pictures with that small box even when nobody wants to stand. She gave me one because he read the poem fast." She smiled, and the room warmed. One of those small fires that happen when memory lets you be proud for a second without being punished. "I can get it." "Bring it," Katz said. His voice was neutral and not neutral. He had already thought of the tools: knife, gum, wheat paste, pencil for the pupils that fail to point in the right direction after. He disliked those tools when they were used to sell lies. He believed in them when they were used to sew a family together across an absence. "And bring him," he said again. "If he is sleeping, we will make it so he is sleeping into you." The neighbor with the cart came because the neighbor knew you do not say no to mothers. Eli fitted into a pile of blankets like a small king traveling incognito. They covered his face lightly, the way people cover cakes when they don't want flies and don't want to admit there are flies. People on the street glanced and did not glance. You learn not to stare at grief because staring makes it mad, and stares can be caught. The cartwheel squeaked at every third revolution like an argument about to be lost. In the studio, Mabel sat in the chair Katz reserved for women who needed to look like officers of their own lives. He placed a cushion on her lap, then a folded cloth so the edge of the cushion would not press her legs and make their shape tell the story the dress would refuse to tell. He nodded toward the cart, and the neighbor hovered, waiting for instruction the way he had waited for work since June. Katz said, "Take your time," which is a sentence that means nothing and everything at once when time is exactly not what a person possesses. She took Eli in her arms the way you lift bread from an oven when you know it will fall if you jostle it, and also know it is already fallen. He rested because resting was what he had decided to be good at. Katz adjusted a lamp, then another. He had a way with light that felt like an apology and a plea. He touched the side of the chair where her elbow would rest and said, "Here," as if the wood could take some of the weight of what her bones were bearing. The first exposure was ordinary, Mabel and a sleeping boy, except that Katz saw the slight part of a mouth and thought, "This is two pictures, not one." The second exposure, he asked for a tilt of her head and a lowering of her eyes, because he had learned that photographs are instruction manuals for people who will never meet the people in them. He wanted the future to understand where to look. When it was done, he set the plates with a care that acknowledged the blood of saints and thieves alike. He waved the neighbor away with promises. He told Mabel to sit as long as she wished. He brought her a cup of water and left it on the table, because sometimes you must be 2 steps away from mercy for it to work. "Miss Foster," Mabel said suddenly, remembering as if a hand had reached in and placed the thought where she could touch it. She fumbled in the pocket for the folded paper, the small photograph. It was the size of a palm. Eli stood on a stoop, a book crooked under his arm because he thought that's what scholars did. He had a black smudge on his cheek where a coal had argued with him earlier that day. His pupils gleamed like any child's who is both proud and scared. Someone will notice his pride and take it. Katz studied the scrap and the plates cooling in trays. He did not like what he was about to decide, and could not decide otherwise. "Come tomorrow," he said. "Come in the afternoon." The word afternoon is a promise and a risk. It makes people think there will be one. At home, the room resumed its claim on them. Eli slept. The fever didn't return. The thin line between this world and the next did not thicken. It thinned so gently, she wondered if perhaps there had only ever been this one room. If she closed her eyes, she could believe the photographs would keep him, could believe that paper sometimes holds better than bone. She returned to the studio the next day, with her head already bowed, as if she were preparing to speak to someone too powerful to look at, and also too important to look away from. Katz had arranged the prints on the counter, each like a proof of life sent in from the edge. There was the one where she looked at the camera because protocols demanded it. There was the one where she looked at Eli. And there, centered, matte wrapped in a careful border, a decision made and done, was the picture you have been holding all this time. A woman hugging her son, and the boy's face not quite belonging to the light that held it. He had made a composite. He had retouched, a word polite enough to dress for company and brutal enough to deserve a gun. He had sliced around the edges of the school photograph with a knife normally tasked with saving careers, and instead asked it to sew a body from disparate pieces. He had set Eli's sharp little face over the slackness of sleep because the world did not deserve to see a boy mid-battle and call it a weakness. He had adjusted the eyes because sometimes the shape of a truth must be guided to look like itself. He had burnished. He had breathed. He had signed the bottom of the mount smaller than he ever signed anything. "It is not right," Mabel said, because she was honest in the way that makes honesty look like cruelty. "It is right," she said, in the same breath, because love often argues itself into a shape someone can hold. "You will know," Katz said. "But anyone else," he spread his hands, meaning anyone else will see only the thing they want to see. A mother with her son, a year with its proof, a future with something to point to. She paid. He watched her lay the coins down like the names of unbaptized saints. He wanted to return the money to her palm. He did not. He knew what hunger looked like when it wore the clothes of pride. That night she put the photograph on the table and watched it until the lamp decided to stop trying. She placed it next to Eli's pillow the way people set a glass of water near a sickbed, because one day the need will find it. In the morning, he woke and saw it, and smiled the smile children give when they see themselves and like what they see. Rare, pure. "Look," he said, foggy. "I am pressed like laundry." She laughed, tears surprising them both, a wash of relief at hearing any metaphor from him again. A week later, the fever returned. The doctor came and stood in the doorway with the hat in his hands that had taught him already how to apologize. He said words. Words do not matter when they arrive at houses that needed a different guest. Eli left when no one was looking, because children often do the hardest things the kindest way they can. The photograph did not change. The photograph did not have to. After, grief rearranged the room. It took a chair and made it different. It took a window and taught it one less way to let in light. It took the photograph and made it the altar of an apartment that had no surface broad enough for flowers. It sat on the mantel. Neighbors brought casseroles all heat and no taste. The landlord knocked softly for a month, and then not softly. Miss Foster came and stood with her good hands and said nothing. The neighbor with the cart fixed the squeak. Cat sent over an extra copy of the picture without saying he had, with a mount a little thicker than the other, as if thickness could keep a thing from bending when people tried to make it fold. Years work on paper the way water works on stone, patiently. The photograph traveled with Mabel through the rooms she could afford. It saw soup thickened with potatoes, and then potatoes thinned with water, and then canned peaches, when someone sent a box marked with a church's handwriting. Joseph never returned. His absence took up less space year by year, until one day it was the size of an earring lost years ago, and only missed when you touch your ear, and remember it should be heavier. When the worst of the depression had turned into an edge, people learned to walk without looking down. Mabel tucked the photograph into a book for safekeeping. The book held sermons for bad weather. The picture held its own. She brought it out on the day in 1939 the radio said war had happened somewhere else. She brought it out when she changed apartments. She brought it out when a neighbor's boy fell from a stoop and told the mother, "Hold him the way I did. Put your arms like a roof." The neighbor did not understand how a picture could be a manual. She understood everything else. She grew old the way the careful do, slowly, with an inventory. Her hair whitened to a silver that refused to be precious. Her fingers, which had spent decades lifting things heavier than they could bear, grew thin and knotted and proud of both. She taught herself how to make coffee stronger without having more coffee. She learned to say the names of presidents like weather. She took the photograph down and dusted it, and put it back and told it things like a person tells a grave until the telling felt less like a speech than the kind of diary remark the living are allowed every day. Sometimes she questioned the face, the light that had no source, the pupils that had been persuaded to look the same direction by a stranger's pencil. She wondered if she had done something unforgivable in the Church of Honesty. Then she remembered the night a boy had slept into her and known how to make his weight a blessing. She forgave herself again. In 1964, on a Sunday that had forgotten its clouds on some other street, her granddaughter, Marta, whose front teeth overlapped like two paragraphs unwilling to merge, was sent to fetch the good tablecloth from the trunk. The trunk had a smell that married paper and damp and linen forgotten by a door that sticks. Marta lifted the lid and found the photograph laid across the folded cloth, like a page left there for someone who reads. "Grandma," she called, because some words only make sense in the right throat. "Who is this?" "That is me, and that is Eli," Mabel said, not looking up at first. It was a safe sentence by then, safe the way knives are safe when handles fit hands. When she did look up, she saw the tilt of Marta's head, the kind of tilt children give when something they love displeases them for the first time, and they decide whether to keep it anyway. "What is wrong with his face?" Marta asked. Not cruel, not the way bullies ask, but the way a nurse asks a wound whether it wishes to stop. It looks... She struggled. Children are good at names and bad at lying. It looks like a picture inside a picture. It is, Mabel said. She put the cloth aside and took the photograph with both hands and set it on the table more carefully than she had ever set a bowl. A man helped me. I wanted... Her voice failed for a moment. It went to look for the way back and found a new one there. I needed something to hold. Marta leaned closer. Why? Because loving is heavy, Mabel said simply. And sometimes paper is strong. They looked together. The girl saw the gloss of the eyes, the crispness that did not belong to that light. The woman saw the day when she had first thought she could buy back time for 3 sacks of flour and 2 coins she would never again have. It feels wrong, Marta said softly. It is wrong, Mabel said. Then, it is right. They both nodded, 2 heads consenting to hold a contradiction without breaking. When Mabel died, she left the photograph to Marta, written in a will with a sentence that sounded like the kind of instruction manuals women leave each other when those manuals are meant to be hid. Keep this where you keep the good napkins. Look at it only when you need it. Use it to teach where to look when everything looks fine and is not. Decades later, in a small exhibit called Ordinary Families, mounted in the local library with grant money that asked for acknowledgements, the photograph hung among others. Men with hats on Sunday steps, girls who had sewn their own collars, babies with open eyes that you did not wish to imagine how they came to open. People paused at this one longer than most. A woman adjusted her glasses and then did not put them back because the blur helped her not cry. A man said to his wife, "It's almost right," which is the kind of sentence you carry home and put next to your salt where you can reach it. A student with a notebook stood a long time and took notes with a pencil that needed sharpening the whole time but did not get it because moving would have broken something. Mother's arms, real. Boy's face, painted light. "What is mercy?" she wrote, then drew a line between the words and a small square where she indicated eyes. Near closing, an elderly man stopped in front of it and placed his hand very close to the glass without quite touching it, as if in deference to whatever kept glass from being an invitation. He did not smile. He did not frown. He was the kind of person who had learned as a young man that faces are not flags. "Katz's work," he murmured to no one. He recognized the signature in the corner because in 1931 he had been the boy who swept the studio and learned to paint pupils. He did not regret. He did not regret. He stood there long enough for the guard to wonder if standing should be a crime. Then he nodded to the woman, the boy, the absent man with scissors, and left, moving away with the careful gait of someone carrying an old ledger, balanced heavy and safe. If you hold the photograph now, if you are the sort of person who takes it out of its frame and lifts it into light, because some lessons cannot be learned under glass, you will see the seams you can't feel. You will notice the way the mother's breath shapes the boy's hair, 1/1000th of an inch of movement, real enough to have been caught but wasn't, because the exposure needed stillness more than truth. You will notice the way his mouth makes the wrong decision about a shadow on its right side. You will notice the way her fingers do not fully indent the sleeve, because the face has severed the sleeve from obeying the rules of pressure. And then you will stop noticing the wrong and notice only this: the forehead that rests against the hollow beneath her neck, the way her chin is lowered to let him be taller, the way her whole body turns into a wall with a window, allowing light in only where it will not harm. The offness is not an error. It is the price of mercy rendered in silver and ink. It is the grain-level scar of a choice made in a room with a coal stove that needed feeding, and a boy's breath that needed guarding, and a mother's need that needed naming. Pictures like this teach a way of seeing that ordinary happiness never has to learn. They instruct you to look for the place where light disobeys, where gloss presses too hard, where pupils shine with a kind of certainty the rest of the world cannot afford. They remind you that in the longest winters, people make warmth out of wrongness and then spend the rest of their lives forgiving themselves for it. And still, the photograph does not leave you in righteousness. It leaves you in love, which is less tidy. When you set it down and turn it over and see the cheap pencil scrawl, 1931, you feel the tilt of that year again. The way it asked the living to do so much living, they ran out of bread. You think of a man who went to Indiana and became absence instead of story. You think of a woman who boiled water not for tea and made soup that wanted to be stew but wasn't. You think of a boy who pressed his ear to the floorboards to hear a neighbor's radio telling him about a country that could not decide if it would take care of him. And if you look one last time at the boy's face, the one that does not belong to the light and somehow belongs more than anything, you might see that the offness has given way to recognition, that what unsettled at first now settles you with a weight you decide to carry, that the wrongness is the sign you needed, not a flaw, a mark, a small scar visible to the eye that lets the heart tell itself the full story. A woman hugged her son in 1931 because he was still there and because one day he would not be. A photographer listened to a request that could not be said aloud and did a small violence to the physics of the world so that mercy could be printed and kept in a drawer. A granddaughter learned to look longer. A boy slept and then left and is now the gleam in a stranger's eyes when they say inexplicably, "Something feels off," and stand without moving for a long time. You set the photograph back. The room resumes its breath. You understand that off is sometimes how love looks when it refuses to accept the rules of winter. And you realize that the impulse to circle things in red that channel the modern world uses to tell people where to look is not new. Mabel carried the circle in her arms. Katz traced it with a pencil around a face that needed to be kept. Your eyes finish the circle now, as you bend once more and see.